Step 7. Give your passage a provisional structure. A summary of this step. Label your provisional main points and big idea in your passage. Ask yourself the following questions. How would you subdivide the text? What title would you give to each of those sections? And then you need to summarize the point of the passage, the big idea, in one sentence. That's the main teaching or the main message of the passage. Introduction. John Stott writes this: every text has a main theme. If God speaks through what he has spoken, then it is essential to ask ourselves, what is he saying? Where does his emphasis lie? Stott says, I'm not denying that there may be several legitimate ways of handling a text and several different lessons to learn from it. What I am asserting, however, is that every text has an overriding thrust. We need the integrity to discern this and to resist the temptation to give the text a twist or a stress of our own. A method. First, try to summarize the passage in your own words. This is actually an excellent way to work out whether or not you've really understood the passage. If you're not able to summarize the passage succinctly in your own words, then probably you haven't understood it clearly yet. Next, divide the passage into themed sections. Having worked out the logic of the passage back in step 5, and having summarized its content, you're now ready to divide the passage up into sections. Where does one idea end and another one begin? You need to give each section a title and note down the verse numbers that make up each section. John Stott writes this: the golden rule for sermon outlines is that each text must be allowed to supply its own structure. The skillful expositor opens up his text, or rather permits it to open itself before our eyes, like a rose unfolding to the morning sun and displaying its previously hidden beauty. So there may be a number of main points to draw from a passage, but we must let the passage speak for itself. We must be careful to take our structure from the passage and not impose a structure on the passage. John Stott again writes this: to make the 3-point sermon our invariable practice would be to confine ourselves to a straitjacket. It also does violence to many texts which only make 1 point or 2, or for that matter, may be naturally divisible into 4 or even 5. Yet he writes, it is strange how often the natural is the triple. The most important point to note here is that the passage, not the preacher, must determine how many points your sermon will have. Well, third, summarize the main teaching or the main message of the passage, the big idea, in one sentence. Ask yourself, what was the author trying to communicate in this passage? What's the passage talking about? Ultimately, we need to ask the question of Alikmatia: what is the one thing that all the other things are about. So the goal here is to determine the one subject that best relates all the details of the passage without being too broad. It's the big idea that we're looking for, and it's this big idea that will stand at the center of our preaching. The preacher J.H. Jowett once wrote these words. He said, "I have a conviction that no sermon is ready for preaching until we can express its theme in a short, pregnant sentence as clear as crystal. I find that getting that one sentence to be the hardest, the most exacting, and the most fruitful labor in my study. I do not think any sermon ought to be preached or even written until that sentence has emerged, clear and lucid as a cloudless moon." And be prepared for some surprises. Mark Dever writes this: "In preparing my normal expositional sermon, I'm often surprised by the things I find in the passage as I study it. I will be surprised by the point of the passage, and therefore by what must become the point of my message." James chapter 1, verses 5 to 8 says this: "If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. But when you ask, you must believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. That person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Such a person is double-minded and unstable in all they do." So what's the passage about? Well, we might decide that it's all about wisdom. And it certainly is about wisdom, but that's too broad a description. A better description of this passage is how to obtain wisdom. And in fact, the context gives another detail: how to obtain wisdom in the midst of trials. Now remember that this is only your provisional structure for the sermon. You can fine-tune things when you get to step 10, having thought further about your passage. But let's try some examples for practice. Read 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 to 7, and answer the following questions. What's the subject of this passage? And then secondly, what does this passage say about this subject? Please pause the video at this point to complete the exercise. So what's the subject of 1 Timothy 3, 1 to 7? Well, I'm sure you've seen that it's all about the task and the character of the overseer, the local church leader. But what does this passage say about that subject? Well, it tells us in verse 1 that desiring to be a church leader is a good thing. It tells us in verse 2 about what an overseer should be like. And then in verse 3, it tells us what an overseer should not be like. It tells us in verses 4 to 5 about the expected family life of those who want to be overseers. It tells us in verse 6 that the overseer shouldn't be a recent convert. It tells us in verse 7 that the overseer should be someone who has a good reputation with those who are outside of the church. Okay, now read Psalm 150. I want you to summarize the message of Psalm 150 in one sentence and then divide the passage into its themed sections. please pause the video at this point to complete the exercise. So summarize the message of Psalm 150 in one sentence. Well, the message of Psalm 150 is praise the Lord. In many ways, the big idea of the passage is pretty easy to spot here. But notice how the passage divides up. Verse 1, praise the Lord because he reigns over all. Verse 2, praise the Lord because of all that he has done. Verses 3 to 5, praise the Lord with music and dancing. And then verse 6, praise the Lord with the whole of creation. Finally, let's remind ourselves of the key questions we must ask ourselves for this step. Questions to ask ourselves as preachers. Have I subdivided the passage into appropriate sections? Have I labelled each section? Have I isolated the main points of the passage in one sentence?